Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for this warm welcome. So it's really a pleasure to be back here again after 4 years. I was here in December of '09, and at that time I described the successful experience with Sharing Plow and talked about basic principles of leadership. But two important things have happened since that time. Number one, my book came out, which you just heard about from Bill. But secondly, in addition to the 6 case histories that I have in the book, we actually have a 7th one, which is the dramatic turnaround and transformation of Bausch & Lomb, where I was not the CEO, but I was the chairman, and my colleague from Sharing Plow, Brent Saunders, was the CEO. And we use the same playbook, the same principles, and the turnaround of this 150-year-old company was very, very impressive. So this really does work. It works again and again, and it's really multi-industry. It goes across many industries. In fact, I've talked about this even to companies in the retail sector. So these are the 6 takeaways in the book, and I'll talk about each one of them. And it's against the backdrop of our industry. That's the most important thing. But before I go to these takeaways, let me just talk about the industry ecosystem. And all of you probably would identify with this. I'll just make a very quick summary of this ecosystem. So the tailwinds, the biggest tailwind is the unmet needs. They are huge. They're everywhere, even in regular diseases like blood pressure, cholesterol. We are really only partway there. There's a lot of advances that can be made. Right now we're going through a specialty care cycle, which is wonderful, but I think we can do lots in many areas. I cannot think of any other sector out there, any other sector, where so much can be done for so many people as our sector. Baby boomers started turning 65 2 years ago, and for the next 16 years, we're going to see a huge expansion in the market. Every year, 10,000, every day, 10,000 people become over 65. And also, the average prescription usage of a person over the age of 65 is well over 5 RXs. The new sciences and technologies are impressive. We all know about these. In fact, very recently we've seen some fantastic breakthroughs of products being approved, especially in difficult diseases like Hep C, major advances. Hopefully some new things coming along in cancer. Lots of new things happening in Alzheimer's. So lots of new sciences and technologies that will expand the market. And then emerging markets, which is really a big opportunity. In fact, this was one very important way that Sharing Plow grew nicely. Emerging markets that we had not been in the past in a big way, became 12% of the company by the time we were at the end of our transformation period. When I started in 1972 with Sandoz, which is now Novartis, we were focused on only about 1 billion of the 4 billion people in the world at that time. Today, our industry focuses on about 6 out of the 7 billion people in the world, and then we try to work with special programs to get to everybody. But it's a much broader field than used to be the case. And 70 million people enter the middle class every year, primarily from large countries like China and Brazil and India, but this is happening all over the world. 70 million new people entering the middle class every year. Our industry's headwinds are well known, the regulatory hurdles. The regulatory science has not kept up with all the other sciences that are happening out there. Also, the variability in decision making in different parts of the regulatory bodies is still an issue that confronts our industry. That still remains a challenge. And for individual companies, there is still a very heavy burden to get a new molecular entity across the goal line. And we still need to conduct large, expensive double-blind, placebo-controlled trials with 100% source data verification, with adaptable, flexible, single-arm trials, many requiring only risk-based monitoring would suffice. So regulatory innovation really hasn't kept up with science innovation. Payer hurdles have worsened everywhere as health budgets everywhere are fighting to avoid deficits. This whole ratio of people over the age of 65 and divided by the number of people between the ages of 20 and 65, that ratio is turning in the wrong direction in every market of the world, literally in every market. And probably the most acute inflection of that curve is in China, where it's going to be a huge change over the next several decades. And this is going to be an issue with healthcare budgets because there's not going to be enough money in the healthcare budget. Every healthcare budget around the world is under stress already, and that stress will only worsen. R&D success rates. I was with Commissioner Young in the mid-80s. He had just finished a study. He told me very proudly that 75% of molecules entering phase 3 go on to the market. That was the ratio at that time. About half of phase 3 projects are now making it across the goal line. So this is an attrition factor that's really very hurtful, and it really is also driving away investment capital away from R&D, VC capital away from small businesses that really need the money. This is a major, major challenge. As I write in my book, we need to reinvent, our industry needs to reinvent the product portfolio by 70% every 10 years in order to keep up with product exclusivity expiries. 70% is the rough ratio. And as I showed at another meeting recently, there is this chart, which is very frightening. This is what I call the 10-year freshness index, where the whole industry is reinventing itself. We were at about that ratio until about 2006, and now it's dropped to a very frightening level, a low level of 46%. Now this is just for big pharmas. For smaller companies, this ratio is a little better, but it's still below 70%. And I do give credit to my friend Murray Aitken from IMS for these analyses. I believe Murray is on the advisory board of the pharmaceutical executive. In my present world at Warwick Pincus, we work with a term IRR that you might have all heard of, internal rate of return, that also accounts for the time value of money. And if you look at the IRR numbers for our industry, that's now on R&D, the IRR is at 7.2%, which is below the cost of capital. So this is just not a good environment, because in such an environment, CEOs are under pressure to return money to the shareholders through buybacks or dividends as opposed to investing in R&D when your IRR is below the cost of capital. So the tailwinds and the headwinds in our industry require an attitude of reinvention and special work, and I will now go into some of the takeaways from my book with their application to our industry. Authentic leadership starts by being authentic with oneself. As I write, it's very important to look in the mirror and know who you are, and more importantly, who you are not. Similarly, it's very important to really know what your company is good at and where it's not very good at. It's not just good enough to delegate the annual review of the SWOT analysis, the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats, to the planners and let the file collect dust until the next year's planning meeting. It's much more important that leaders are very aware of their company's strengths and weaknesses and constantly pressure test the assumptions behind these strengths and weaknesses. Being in touch with your own company's SWOT is very important. It's also very important to, so I'll quickly digress and explain authenticity in the context of a story in the book. When I was in Wyeth in 1991, I was heading up both Wyeth Domestic and Wyeth R&D. And we had made a very tough call on the head of R&D. We had moved him out, and we were going to be looking for a new head of R&D. I was very frustrated with the development function, and I suggested to my colleague at that time, Bob Esner, who later on went on to become CEO of Wyeth, whether I should split R&D and have the D function report to me directly, since it was not doing very well. And Bob asked me a question, which was a very wise question, and made me more authentic with myself. He said, "Fred, are you an R&D guy?" And that's all he had to ask, because that helped me decide very quickly to get in Bob Levy, who then created a whole new train of new products that actually turned Wyeth into a very strong R&D machine. Sometimes it's important that people tell you also what they think you should be thinking about. And that was an important example to me of trying to being authentic with yourself. So looking in the mirror is really very important. The next slide is to be purposeful. This is important because you first have to start with purpose yourself as a leader, and then create a sense of being purposeful for the whole company. So in this context, it's very important to know what you want and how you're going to get there. It's also very important to create the vision, mission, value statements, and clarify and communicate expectations of your people. People want to hear the declaration. They want to hear from their... Sometimes we do not communicate enough as leaders. So this is extremely important. And at Bausch & Lomb, which is our most recent case history, we created a very nice core document. I'll show you a picture of that very shortly. But the whole idea is to create a bigger meaning for the people. At Bausch & Lomb, we had this slogan, live better, see better. We didn't talk about 15% EPS growth, or people, of course, knew we were looking for the results, but let's think about the fact that if we are in the business of preventing blindness or helping people see better, isn't that a great mission? And people felt good about that around the world. So creating this bigger sense of meaning is extremely important. So this is the core document that we had for our, and I've had these similar core documents also in the other places that I was at. The next takeaway is to be connected. This means being in touch with yourself and with people around you and the stakeholder communities that are important to the enterprise. So there are so many good CEOs I know who did not remain very good CEOs because this part did not work well for them. Either they lost their connection with themselves or they lost the connection with their communities. And building active listening and learning skills is very important. This is important not only for yourself but also throughout the organization. But you can't expect that from your own people if you don't do it yourself in the first place. And in pharma, being connected with the lawmakers is very important. It's very important in a regulated industry. And I mentioned a very interesting story in my book about Part D legislation in 2003. It just happens to be the last big thing happened before the present controversy around Obamacare. We were able to, as an industry, get that one to go very well. Coverage for seniors went up from 60% to 90%, and at a much lower cost than what was expected. We worked on both sides of the aisle and were able to get that change to occur. That was a very good piece of work that the industry did. So it's important to work with people who really matter. And also, it's important to connect with customers by building trusting relationships. This is important not only in terms of the executives, but especially to create that atmosphere throughout the whole company. And that is extreme. Some companies have that, others don't do such a good job. This means also being very pro-patient in everything we do. As long as we are pro-patient, it's much easier to deal with a lot of the issues that surround our industry. It's also easier to deal with the health technology assessment people. And also, it's important to be able to show that one can replace expensive services with medicines, and also getting the patients to comply with the medicines that they are prescribed. And in a few cases, it's important to show that overprescribing is not a good idea. It's not good for the patient. We should be in the forefront on that issue as well. The next one I think is very important, which is to say keep leading. Keep leading means once you've got this external machine in place, you've got to build this inspiring leadership that will get your people to focus on the business. If you can focus on the people, they then will focus well on the business. It's fine to get in there and learn the business, but you have to let the people run the business. And this also includes building resonance with the front lines. In April 2011, I authored an article in the Harvard Business Review on this subject, and I described in that how important it is to get execution to be enhanced by being in resonance with the frontline managers. These are the first-tier supervisors who directly influence the motivation and morale of the people who are doing the execution. It's incredible how the execution can be great in one company because that part works well, and in other companies, conventional systems, execution is average. So the frontline part is really the big secret. It's also very important to pick the very best R&D head, and then to partner with that R&D person and become excellent in R&D. If you look at the companies in our industry that are very good versus the mediocres, the gap is huge and the delta in shareholder value is huge. This is a major driver of value, and it's really surprising to me that even at this time there may be several large companies where this part is not working as well as it should be working. And then it's very important to be bold on R&D portfolio decisions and project management. Pruning and focusing so that you work on things that really matter, where you're really going to win, and then driving the product winners to their goals. If you're going to start something, then finish it. There are so many examples where things got started, somebody new came along, the previous person got blamed, and the project didn't go anywhere. That is a waste of assets. It's not good for the shareholders. It's really the right thing to do to really do this part right. And absolutely rely on the head of R&D, but CEOs have to be pretty close to this area themselves, because this is a driving function in terms of shareholder value long term. I personally have always obsessed over this, and I see that in certain companies, and I'll just name a few that I've noticed in our industry. I think Novo Nordisk has that. I think Johnson & Johnson certainly has that. Celgene, Biogen, Gilead. I see those characteristics in those companies where R&D is central DNA, central to the enterprise. People plus culture plus execution drives superior success. And to make this happen, so again, I'll just repeat that. People plus culture plus execution drives success. And to make this happen, it's very important to role model your expectations as a leader. People will trust you and follow you if you do what you say. For good role modeling to occur, it is very important to pick the very best possible team at the top. Because that decision, that important decision of picking the level 2 team, that is what creates credibility for you for the rest of the organization. At Bosch and Lomb and at other companies that I was involved with, we made it very clear that for every member of the team at the top, they had to be excellent in their own areas. So if you're R&D, you've got to be very, very good in that. If you're in marketing, very, very good in that. But also, in addition to that, they had to be inspirational leaders of their people that they led. They had to inspire them, get the most out of their own people. And finally, they had to be committed to rooting for their other level 2 colleagues. This third one is the hardest because it's in so much of corporate America, you see division heads finding ways to compete and undermine each other. This should not be tolerated if you really want a cohesive team at the top to lead transformational change in the company. There have been several examples in my own career where a very talented leader had 1 or 2 of these characteristics, but not all the 3. And if all 3 were not present, they were taken out and new people brought in. One has to be very tough and disciplined, because if you don't do that, your own credibility is going to suffer. So by expecting this team to role model the attitudes and behaviors, one can keep moving toward that culture of executional excellence that will lead to superior results. And finally, keep winning. Keep reinventing yourself and your environment. We keep hearing so many times things were going great and then that company couldn't keep up. I was at a recent meeting and the speaker was saying there was a time when under Dr. Vagelos, Merck's R&D was unbeatable, but now it's gone through a prolonged period of difficulty. So it's very important to not let success let you start to get the entropy effect, the declining effect. And it really always starts with leadership. It's important to keep the executional flywheel going, to pay attention to the details in a fast-changing environment, and especially in our industry's fast-changing environment, to stay attuned, to stay flexible, agile in this environment is extremely important. Always important not to let complacency get in there. Certainly never tolerate arrogance as one gets successful. I've seen companies start to show arrogance because they're very successful. That is the beginning of their decline, as far as I'm concerned. Always important to stay grounded, stay humble, keep pressure testing ways of doing things, and keep working to raise the bar. It's always important to keep working to raise the bar. So my final slide, which is the 6 takeaways: be authentic, be purposeful, be connected, keep leading, role model your expectations, and keep winning. These are takeaways that have worked for me in 6 different cases, and also again in Bosch and Lomb. I personally believe very strongly in our industry. There are many growth scenarios that one looks at. I personally think we are going to be growing faster than the GDP over the next 10 years, and I think our profits are even going to grow faster than the sales. So let's say if GDP is going to grow 3 to 4%, we should grow 5 to 6% top line, and our bottom line should be high single digits. There is no reason, as I said earlier, with the tailwinds that we have, why we cannot be growing faster than the GDP. We know we've gone through a very difficult last 10 years, but we did go through 3 very good decades before that time. What we do benefits mankind greatly. We have a great mission, and I personally think we were all very fortunate to be in this industry, because it really is a great industry. So my final takeaway for all of you is it always begins with attitude, attitude, attitude. That's the beginning of behavior and culture that creates enormous productivity increases. So with those words, thank you very much.